Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health and generously funded by the First Nations Health Authority. I'd first like to start by acknowledging the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, where we're hosting this session from. Also like to acknowledge and remind folks that the sessions that we hold are of relevance to our communities, and topics sometimes can be emotionally sensitive or triggering, so please ensure that you look after yourselves today. If you need to talk to someone, grab a colleague or a friend or an elder or a counselor. So really excited today to welcome Sharon and Mary. I'll introduce them a little bit more in a moment. My name is Melanie Rivers. I'm from the Squamish Nation. My Statliam name is Mwamwit, and I'm the education coordinator with the UBC Learning Circle. So I'll read out Sharon and Mary's bios to you. Really excited about today's topic on A Dance of Belonging, a 60s scoop story of healing and transformation. A topic really important to our communities, another colonial event that happened to our people as a part of assimilation agenda by the Canadian government, that's had a lot of hurt and impacts to our communities that still cycle to today, as well as it's not necessarily a thing of the past, with the foster school system still being about half of the children in care being Indigenous. So very relevant as well to today, and how that impacts people's sense of identity and belonging and reconnection with community and family. So Sharon's going to share her personal story, as well as the work that she did with Mary as a music therapist to do some of her own healing. So Sharon Jinkerson-Brass, if I've said that correctly, is a member of Key First Nation in Saskatchewan. She was part of the 60s scoop, but reunited with her family in the 1980s. She received her cultural teachings from her beloved Anishinaabe, grandmother Rebecca, who was a midwife and traditional healer. Sharon's cultural heritage has inspired all of her art and way of living. Sharon is an award-winning artist who was the artistic director of Big Sky, a successful multimedia company that performed in the US and Canada. For 30 years, she has also been a community leader working for social change for the Indigenous communities in the areas of arts, culture, health, and community development. Sharon is currently working on multiple projects in the Aboriginal communities on topics related to health, green energy, and cultural healing. Sharon believes that a relevant, sustainable cultural foundation is the key for wellness for all people, for her people and all people. So welcome, Sharon. And Mary here is an accredited music therapist and a fellow with the Association for Music and Imagery. The Bonny method of guided imagery and music is an integral part of her work, both in its original form in the many adaptations she has devised for use with individuals and groups of all ages. She has presented at conferences on her work using guided imagery and music with a First Nations client, Sharon, I believe, and on music and imagery on healing unresolved grief in children. Mary has written articles and authored chapters for 2 books, The Creative Therapies in Adoption and Foster Care, and Guided Imagery and Music Imagery Methods for Individual and Group Therapy. As well as working under contract with the School District Number 64, Mary offers workshops, retreats, and private sessions in her home community on Pender Island and the wider geographic area. So welcome to you both. So I'll pass it over now to Sharon to share her story.
Well, I just want to start by saying it's an honor to be here, and my given name is Sharon Jinkerson-Brass, but my traditional name is Wapsi Paneshi Ikwe, which means White Thunderbird Woman. And I'd like to acknowledge all the 60s scoopers and the Millennium Scoopers, and want them to know that they're always in my prayers. And as well, our brothers and sisters who were in foster care and who haven't found themselves or in institutions, because the impact of the 60s scoop on our broader community was devastating in terms of the loss of community for our people, but as well the individual loss experienced by those who were apprehended. So I'm going to give myself a minute here to settle down, because it's always so emotional to share, and I'm aware that lots of what I have to say is going to be impactful in many ways for people. One of the qualifiers I want to say is that I went through many stages politically in my journey, and at first was very angry at social workers, at my family for participating in colonization. But now that I'm 60, I realize that they were people with good intentions, and that the broader scheme of colonization wasn't widely known. And I have found compassion and understanding for the oversights. And so at the end of the day, I have a very solid connection to my biological family and my adopted family. But there were many phases that I went through as I developed understanding and compassion. So my story begins with my grandparents, actually, and my mother going to residential school. And just so you can see, here's a picture of my mom in residential school in, I guess this would have been in the 40s, probably, when my mom was about 8 or 9. So if we can have that screen, that picture of my mom. So yeah, there's my mom. She's the one, my musham, my grandfather Solomon, is the tall man in uniform. He was a war vet. And my mom, he's got his hand on my mom's shoulder. And that was my mom in residential school. And beside her is her sister Kathy, and behind her my Uncle Lawrence, and my other auntie who erased her picture. It's interesting, it looks like there's lots of anger and rage, but she did that herself, my Auntie Ethel, and I think it's probably her feelings about being at school, and so she was the one that did that to the picture. So my parents left the reserve, and I was the youngest of 5 children born in Dawson Creek. And so they were far away from their people. My father was a farmer of Eastern European descent, and he had late onset schizophrenia. And so this caused my dad, when he had his breakdown, we were apprehended. And I know in my case, my mother visited me, and that was in the 50s, in the days before advocacy. And eventually, at the age of 7, I was legally adopted. But I had been in multiple foster cares before I was placed with a family who adopted me. And I just want to read a list of the typical issues that's widely accepted are for adoptees are loss and rejection, grief, a loss of identity, fear or anxiety, guilt, shame, and a loss of connectedness to your identity. I guess that's a repeat. But mostly I want to focus on racism, because that was the paralyzing impact of my adoption experience. And in a world where my family who raised me were part of the mainstream middle class, they were British, I think, first generation Canadians. So they were blonde hair and blue-eyed, but meanwhile there was me. And the world I lived in was so secret from my adoptive family, because in my mind I thought if they realized that I was a pariah and being rejected at school, that somehow they might reject me too. So I better keep it a secret. It's an odd way, a survival mode in a child, but that's what I thought I should do. And I wanted to show some pictures of me in school now. Oh, I am with my family, and that's what I was saying, how you can see in my body language, I'm holding myself. I've got my arms crossed, and I'm slightly away from the family. They're all relaxed and fitting in the frame, but there's a little uncomfortable me. And one of the things that I typically did as a coping mechanism was always place myself a little bit away from the family, because I was terrified of comparison. And I'll read a few poems which will illustrate exactly why I felt frightened. So this first poem is called The Butcher. And if we flip forward to the next screen, you'll see how when I was little, I was a lot darker. Now I never go in the sun because of what's happened, but I was obviously mixed heritage when I was young, and that's less evident today. But I wrote this poem, which is recently published in Room magazine, about one of the experiences that was traumatizing. It's called The Butcher. "Oh, a dark one, eh?" the butcher remarked to my unprepared adopted mother. Her white, blonde skin turned crimson red at the suggestive nature of the well-placed remark. I froze with a knowing beyond my years. I knew the comment was the same reason my aunt stopped talking when I entered the room. I knew it was the same reason my mom shielded me from rowdy Indians in the street, and why she made me look at all the baskets and beadwork in the museum. The mean questions, the sudden silence, the about face in town, the unexplained museum trips. I knew the source of this pain had a great power over me and my adoptive mom. We both had reasons to run. So my mom, in her awkward, uncomfortable way as a young child, used to take me to the museum. And she was an enlightened person in that she respected Indigenous culture and artifacts tremendously. But the problem was, when I went to the museum, there was no truth in that, a full disclosure that these are your people. And so unconsciously, I would look at the museum pieces and never understand. I'd get a lump in my throat. I would panic. My heart would race. I'd want to run out. And my mom would always say, "Oh, that's Sharon. She's just not interested in her culture or heritage." And I remember just throwing myself in the back seat of the car and crying and waiting for my family to come out and hoping that I'd be over the tears before they got there, because I was ashamed. And in retrospect, I realized I was grieving that, looking at all those artifacts, these were my aunties and uncles, these were my grandfathers, these spoke to a land that I didn't know, and an emptiness that was always there, kind of a sadness and something unfulfilled. And I also had bursts of anger when I was young. I used to throw my beloved stuffed animals around in rages and not understand myself. And I was like the classic abusive parent. I'd be like apologizing and loving my Winnie the Pooh, and because I didn't understand. But I think today those rages were just about the frustration, the anger, that there was no honesty. My parents did not have the ability to talk to me in a real way, or for anything that went on in our family. There was no emotional dialogue. So it wasn't just my adoption, it was virtually everything. We just sort of had this stiff upper lip and got on with addressing the problems of life. And this was absolutely devastating. So if we move on, you can see the various stages. There I am, just pre-teen there. And when I became a teenager, an explosion happened inside. I wanted nothing to do with my identity. It was all about fitting in. And when I was about 13, I began to run away. I began to experiment with drugs. And this is all classic 60s scooper stuff. I didn't know why I had such an urge to do the things I was doing, and I would question myself, why are you so naughty? But I just couldn't help it. And my mom and dad's solution was to put me in private school. I was never offered therapy or counseling. There was no suggestion that my early childhood trauma and foster care and my identity might be a factor in what was happening, and it absolutely was. And so as we progressed to the next scene, this is me a bit later, but in my teens I purposely decked myself out to not look native, to look as mainstream as possible, and the whole goal about my identity was to fit in and belong. And I was completely lost and had no substance going on. It was just very shallow, and I valued how I looked, how I dressed. The money I had was all my identity. That's all there was. And I lived in that world until my mid-20s. And private school kind of balanced my life, but it wasn't a solution. Also, as a teenager, I want to admit or acknowledge here that I was also gang raped as a teenager. I'd gone back to public school. I begged and begged to go back to public school. And then because I'd been in private school, and as an adopted person and mixed heritage, you really want to fit in. So I was a sitting duck, and I was basically targeted and given alcohol, and under the influence was exploited. And this is another typical story of the types of vulnerability that accompany people who don't know who they are or have a strong sense of themselves. You're a target for that type of exploitation. So that was never addressed either. It was completely buried. And as a 20-something-year-old, I started to sleepwalk as a stress. And one night I left my apartment door open, and this frightened me. So I was speaking to my family doctor, who was tuning into me. I used to go and see him all the time, fussing about little things, about maladies that were of no great significance, but they worried me, a rash, a little pain here and there. And so he dramatically dropped my medical chart like a dictionary on the table, and he said, "You're a perfect, healthy 25-year-old, but look at your chart." And he plopped it on the table, and he said, "I think what's going on with you is emotional. I don't think it's physical." And I was stunned at that assessment, but I went to see a psychiatrist, and after seeing me, he said, "There's nothing to diagnose here. You're a perfectly sane and lovely socialized person." But he said, "I think your problems are in your roots. And I was like, what do you mean, like Dawson Creek where I grew up? And he's like, no. I'm like, what do you mean the Jinkersons from England? And it took this ridiculous sort of question and answer because it was so far removed from my consciousness, my identity. He said, no, I think your ethnic identity, there's answers for you. And so I began to delve into researching my family. And I phoned my band office and said I discovered that I was treaty status, which was an amazing story. But I contacted my band office and my chief said, I think I know who your granny is and I'm going to talk to her. So then the next day, I'm just going about my business and the phone rang back in the day of landlines. And it was my grandmother, and she said, I heard all this muffling going on, and I'm just about to hang up thinking it was a prank call. And then I hear this, is that you, Sharon? And I went, yeah, it's me. And she said, this is your grandmother. And I remember just like, my grandmother. And so we chatted and introduced ourselves to each other, and she wasn't one for small talk on the phone. She said, I'm going to come and see you. And I went, oh, okay. And I get out my little calendar and I'm flipping the pages. When were you thinking of visiting? And she said, I'll be on the bus at 5. And so all the way from Saskatchewan, which was a 24-hour trip, she took the bus. And immediately when I greeted her, there was a warmth. And there was a knowing and an easiness. I felt like I'd known her all my life. And we sat in my apartment visiting, and she made me bannock, because I said I've never had bannock. Oh, no grandchild of mine can go without bannock another minute. And she was just so charming, and she cooked up bannock, and there we are at 1 in the morning, and I was so colonized. It's like, it's way past eating time. What are we doing? But it was so cool to be with someone that just was in the moment. And then that night, I said to her, Granny, do you want to sleep on my couch or in my bed? And she said, you know, I was a midwife for 40 years. I probably brought most of your aunties and uncles and cousins into the world. And she said, I always slept with those babies on their first night here on this earth. And she said, I'm going to sleep with you tonight. And so I wandered into the bathroom, and I remember the feeling of worthiness and thinking, here's somebody I just met. I don't know her. And she just loves me for who I am. And I remember feeling a sense of terror and fear. It was music to my ears, but the woundedness, the wounds of loss and grief were unhealed still and unacknowledged. And I felt so terrified of intimacy and being close to someone. So I had two things, self-worth and fear of intimacy. And that trek to the bedroom to cuddle in with my grandma felt like a 1,000-mile walk. And I snuggled in with her, and it was so comfortable. She immediately started to stroke my face. And she said, Sharon, you're so gentle, and you're smart, and you're wise and kind. And I can see that you're a generous person. And so I'd grown up in a family where achievement, competition was the order of the day. Success was measured on what you had and what you had accomplished. But here was a woman, my granny, who just loved me for my essence, for who I was. It wasn't based on the apartment I had or what I was studying or the jobs I had. It was just me. And this, if I had to say the difference in finding my Indigenous roots and consciousness and identity compared to my upbringing, is that in my Indigenous family, we have black sheeps, we have people that have bent the rules and hurt others, but they're always welcome at the feasts and the circles. Whereas in my adoptive family, there's black sheep and people don't ever talk to them again. And this experience with my granny was the beginning of learning a whole new set of values, being in the moment. We didn't organize Christmas dinners, which were frequently stressful in my household, because it was a lot about performance and cooking the perfect turkey and dressing the right way. At our feasts, it was everything happened in the moment, and somebody would show up with a bag of flour and realize that they didn't have the lard, and it might mean another trip into the village close to my reserve, and we just were spontaneous in the moment, and in that process really connecting and having a relationship far from the ideals that I'd been raised with. And I took to it, to use a cliche like duck to water. I absolutely embraced it. Felt normal and natural to be living in the moment in that particular way. And then everything was a ritual. My granny smudged every morning when she woke up. And at feasts there was an honoring. And just the consciousness that when we pray, we think of all those ritual songs and dances that happened for thousands of years so we could be alive today. Well, that was another eye-opening consciousness that had never occurred to me. And I would think of my grandmother, my grandmother's grandmother, all the way back to the first one, my granny used to say. And same with my grandfather. So suddenly I was not just a person surviving in the world. I was the current rendition of a DNA that was ancient, that had its roots in this land. I was the keeper. I was this generation, the ambassador for something that was ancient, and the culmination of prayers and dances and feasts that had gone on. So this level of reality became the newness in my life and the way that I saw myself. So I wrote a poem to close off my talk. There's so much more to be said. And then what I want to say is that I also, in addition to knowing my grandmother, I did therapy beyond that counselor. And Mary's going to talk more about the work we did later. So my journey of healing has been a lot about exploring my culture, but I also addressed it with counseling and therapy to work out my relationship, to work out being a mother. I had a son, Solomon, in my mid-30s, and was terrified that I wouldn't be able to bond and connect to him. So I did a lot of counseling, but then later I realized that there was still some deep-seated grief and pain that was limiting my ability to create and to live a complete life. And I began to do the work with Mary. And so I want to read this last little piece before I give it to Mary to talk about the work we did in music and guided imagery, which describes the assuming my identity, and is called Silenced. I feel silenced. I feel invisible, unheard. Who am I? Who are you? Who are we? The empty space is filled with a character of my making. She doesn't really exist. No, she's not a ghost either. Just an empty shrine to something that once was. Is she summer dust? Is she winter snow? Is she crisp, dry, brown leaves on the ground? She allows herself to question the cage, the roots, the dark earth, the dark night. What will the mask reveal? I am a bird. I am really a bird. Thunder, I think. I feel my wings, heavy, dense feathers weigh me down. My wings haunt me. My talons squeeze time. I barely feel my fast-beating heart. My beak chews on a steel bar. Notches become visible. Dreams begin. Jump into the air. Trust, and you will fly. Just try to be you. The bent, awkward creature looks up, hears something beating, stretches her wings, and the first time dares to feel their power. She leaps towards the stars. Her talons release time, and her snowy white wings lift her in the air. Her song echoes around the sky. She feels her strength, honors her otherness. She flies from this world to that world, the place where beingness is inclusive, where stars glow, magic is everything, where light can burn and heal, where truth resolves, where hunger is fed, where the sky is endless and the nights make days forever. And I wrote that about the going from being a mask and nothing to finding my identity. And so that concludes my little talk. I could probably talk for a good few hours about the other experiences and revealing some of the trauma, but that's just a little glimpse. So thank you. Miigwech.
Thank you, Sharon.
Sharon. Always so moving to hear her story, and I always hear more of it every time she speaks. So I thought I should start with a description of the Bonny method of guided imagery in music. The Bonny method is a music-centered exploration of consciousness, and it offers the opportunity to integrate mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual aspects of well-being, and often to awaken to a greater transcendent identity, something more than we are right now. It begins with a conversation between the therapist or facilitator and the client or traveler to just check in with them, find out where they're at, what's going on, how they're feeling, and anything left over from the session previous. And then the facilitator leads the traveler in a relaxation and focusing induction or exercise, some kind of a scan through the body to help deepen the state of relaxation and move the traveler toward an altered state of consciousness. The music is then played, the specially programmed collection of mostly classical music that the facilitator chooses based on where the client is at. And while the music is playing, the traveler may have a wide variety of images that come through the stimulus of the way the music sounds and from their own internal world. Images arise can be all kinds of images. And as a guide, I am there to witness this process and to respond with resonant and encouraging comments, never to tell them where they go with their imagery. I'm not saying walk down the road and do this and that. The imagery is all generated from inside the traveler. And at the end, there's sometimes artwork is done, not always, sometimes spent to help integrate and process the imagery that arose. So this was the work that we did together. And when Sharon came to me initially, I have a client information sheet that I ask people to fill out. And it's rather interesting. There was no mention at all of her biological family. More details given about her adoptive family, and she did talk about the importance of her Ojibwe culture and spirituality as it had changed her life, as we just heard. There was a question, what would you like to accomplish in guided imagery and music? And she said, to access my subconscious, to develop methods of questing in order to heal. So that was the part that she got. But she got probably more than she bargained for throughout. I'd just like to say there are no guarantees what you will get from a guided imagery and music session, even if you set a strong intention. The psyche has its own knowing. It brings us what we need when we are ready. And I've come to really trust that because I've seen it in myself, in my own process, and in clients. You never get more than you can handle. I consider this spiritual work. It's of the spirit. The facilitator, in this case I, become a conduit or an empty vessel for others, for my client to transform or connect into their spirit. It's very intuitive work. So Sharon, she explained some of her background, well, a lot of it. She was taken from her mother at 6 months. She was put in 17 foster homes over the next 11 months. That was the policy. Keep them short-lived so there would be no bonding. And then the adoption we heard about, she refers to it as being stolen from her mother because her mother refused to sign those final papers for adoption. This is the family tree up on the slide. So all of the children were taken from the mother during the 60s and put into homes of, well, that's another story. The places they were put, there was probably trauma for everybody, one way or another. All members of her biological family were prominent in her imagery, even though she didn't mention them when she came in. And I learned gradually through the series that she comes from a long line of Indigenous healers. Granny, who we've heard about, was a medicine woman, and once Sharon reconnected with her culture in her 20s, she received a lot of support and strength from her granny. And the story she just told is like, oh yeah, it's like I know that granny from the imagery, and this is how she was. So it had a prominent position in her imagery. So the next one. After each session, the client, I ask if they have a title for the journey from that day, and that's what these titles are about. The music programs are several selections within each program. They're just titles, really, where you go with the music is very individual. So I'm going to be highlighting some key imagery threads that came up in each session over a 20-month, there's like a 20-month period of Sharon's life. So try to imagine the music. You can't hear it. Try to imagine the music as a sustaining and guiding presence beneath the imagery. Next one. This is a roadmap to keep in mind as we go through the series, which I delineated afterward. The first two sessions are really about setting the stage. She receives a lot of fortification necessary to have the strength to take the journey that was going to arise, which she didn't know about. This just unfolds. Sessions 3 to 5, she was dealing with immediate losses, people dying in her life. Both her biological mother and father-in-law died in this period. Sessions 6 to 8, the loss of her biological family. The family of origin was explored with incredibly intense connections and grief. And sessions 9 and 10 were about integration, affirmation, and healing. She, by then, is getting insights into her own essence and the transgenerational pain in her family. And she's acknowledged and witnessed. So, session 1, which she called Higher Love, or the Gift, it's setting the stage. She receives, through her imagery, information about healing resources for her. Her medicine, the loving support of family, and an experience of the complete trust she needed to undertake the journey ahead. You know, these are just words. It's hard to express the impact of receiving these experiences when you're in an altered state of consciousness. It's big. But all I have are words, so that's what I'm giving you. Session 2, she called the ceremony. This basically was about the essence of Granny. Granny leads Sharon through a ceremony, gets her bundle out, a red blanket, a woman's pipe. She prays and cries.
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
It's okay. Keep going.
She prays and cries to the 4 directions. Granny gives messages of support, kindness, love, and wisdom to Sharon. Gives her strength. And toward the end, they came up to a pool of water, and Sharon looked into it and saw herself reflected back as an older person. She was moving through the ages, seeing all the details and similarities with her granny. She said, "My hands are like hers. I feel the beating of my heart in hers. Her eyes and mine look the same. It's the same kindness and the smile." Very powerful moment. There's a sense of relatives and ancestors there in shadow form offering support. Session 3, there's no title here given by Sharon, but I named it afterward Mother Loss. Sharon's mother dies during this period, and Sharon receives a visitation from her mother's spirit, who is coming to her in the form of a little bird dance, prairie chicken. Sharon receives guidance and support from Granny again, and consoling from Uncle Carson, and she builds a smartwatch with him. This session is about healing current losses in her life. Her mother, and concern about a brother who was struggling with his own life. there's a sense of chaos. What is still needing to be uncovered in order to look at it all? Session 4, she called the dawning of belonging, or strengthening ties. That week, Sharon came in and said, I want to start with a little ceremony. So it was like, okay, whatever. I'm totally open to whatever my client wants to do or needs. It really felt right. So she did this sponge ceremony of us both with sweetgrass and an eagle feather. And what this did was it quickened the altering of her state of consciousness. And it put us both into a state of readiness for opening to the psyche. So it kind of deepened the whole relaxation induction and put us in a place of spirit. So in her imagery, a few of the details, Sharon convinces her brothers to meet her on the reserve, the place of their birth, or near where they were born. Her mother is there and expresses love for Sharon. I know you bring everyone together. We're nothing without our family. And Sharon says, I'll never stop trying. A little later, she's in a canoe with her husband, Peter. There's premonitions of her father-in-law's death. It's a heart-wrenching scene. She receives wisdom and support from her grandfather this time. In this, she's continuing to face the losses, current and past, of human lives and connections. Sharon felt that this session really opened the door to the spirit world. The next session, number 5, she called Release, Embrace. Sharon was afraid to come to her GIM session this day, afraid of what she would get. And I know that feeling. It takes courage to do this work when you are sensitive and you respond really deeply to it. And in her imagery, she had an experience of intense connection, love, and grief with her mother. More grief and goodbyes said to her father-in-law, Herman. She was in the canoe with her husband, Peter, and Herman. Heartbreaking sense as they disembark on the far shore, and Herman remains in the canoe. She meets her auntie and walks in the prairie grass. Auntie talks of the spirit world with Sharon. Asks the Creator to keep Sharon, give her strength and courage, warns her of dark times ahead. And she reminds Sharon of her gifts and her heritage to deal with the losses. Incredibly valuable tool. The next session, number 6, she called Cleansing the Wounds of Loss. Sharon's commitment to her process or journey escalates. She starts to come more regularly for her Bonny method sessions. In her imagery, Sharon is 5 years old. She's a child, and she meets each sibling who she never knew at that age. She cries and feels helpless when she can't reach one of them, James, who's always running away from her, always just out of reach. She's consoled by Uncle Carson, who takes her into the sweat lodge. He says, quote, where our people had cried for thousands of years. Then she transforms into an adult and meets James. Sharon says, it hurts. I see me in you, she says. You're just like me. Do you know what it's like to miss someone you don't even know? This huge empty bucket I tried to fill, but it never felt full. And there's a ceremony with Peter, her husband. He gives her a cedar switch. There in the canoe, she reaches over and washes her face. Peter gives her the cedar switch and instructs, wrap the oil on your skin. Wash your face. It will cleanse the wounds of loss, of loneliness. Sharon pats it all over, and then, taking a deep breath, fully immerses herself in the water. Afterwards, she said, I feel so cleansed. Again, a very deep experience to have in an altered state of consciousness. In this session, she's grieving the losses of her early life. Sharon felt acute separation and loss, pain and emptiness. That huge empty bucket, the void of her matrix. Sharon felt it was what she called a watershed session, which lands the huge well inside of her. She said that over her life she had stuffed both the way she loved people as well as the way she was abused. This session opened up both. That night she had a nightmare, which uncovered abuse memories when she was 4 years old in foster home. Next one is number 7, which she called the dance of belonging. Sharon exists in this session's imagery in big and little form, child and adult. They are playing together, and Big Sharon is nurturing and reassuring the little girl Sharon. She meets her brothers one by one, always protected and reassured by the Big Sharon when it gets too intense or scary. She touches hands with one brother. In her words, we open our hands and they're just the same. Deep love and gratitude are expressed. There is pain and tears and unimaginable joy. Again, experiencing the pain, the tears, and the altered state of consciousness is a really profoundly affecting and deep experience to have. In this session, Sharon's strengthened inner and higher self is now a wise, compassionate adult. Sometimes the little Sharon would run into her arms when there was a really gripping moment and be held by the big one. Sharon is able now to do the courageous work of meeting each sibling, feeling intensely losses and connectedness towards the rebuilding of her matrix. Number 8, she called Wolf Woman. This was a transition session, moving from grief to affirmation for Sharon. Upon arrival, she reported feeling shaken and disempowered. She was concerned about challenges in one brother's family and was having a spate of terrifying dreams. In the imagery, Sharon is in a beautiful garden when her brother is sighted. Wolves appear and surround them. The brother howls too, crying with intense grief. A lodge appears on the other side of the lake, in the spirit world. An elder instructs, there is a ceremony and fire. He says, the wolf will be loyal to you always, you and your brother. She will never leave you, ever. The spirit people kiss Sharon. Her husband Peter, in this ceremony, places a wolf blanket on the brother's shoulders. And Mom appears in the circle. One brother asks her, what happened? What happened in your life? She cries and is unable to talk about it. And hearing these words, the siblings react in varied and emotional ways. In this session, Mother revealed her grief openly to her children. Sharon is able to address her disturbing helplessness by taking the part of healer and performing her own ceremony this time, doing a ritual in the lodge and getting the support of the ancestor spirits. Number 9, called White Thunderbird Woman Walks. Sharon was feeling exposed when she came in. She was recalling more disturbing childhood memories and also experiencing more synchronicities in her life. She was wishing for a connecting of fragments and pieces, whether through healing or further experience, and it was her son's birthday. In the imagery, she spends time with her son at different ages. Granny appears and tells her what a good job she is doing with Simon. An affirmation given Sharon's own troubling childhood, affirmation of her parenting. There is a special outfit made for her by Granny. It has a red shawl with a white thunderbird on it. She puts it on and says, "I feel so whole." Granny watches, rubs her face and holds it, gives tea and medicine, wraps the shawl around Sharon tightly, and Sharon has a sense, she says, it is like her love being wrapped around me. Sharon does these same nurturing things to her grieving brother and his family, and to her son, the same as Granny has done so many times for her. Afterwards, Sharon said, "I was who I was meant to be, big and beautiful. I felt like myself." The session was an experience of bliss. The clothing was an outward manifestation of who she is now. Now was the time to wear the outfit and the role, to offer love and healing to others, as Granny has done to her. Session 10 she called Granny's Ceremony. She arrived feeling anxiety and a fear of rejection in the community because of a recent incident that she felt might be racist. In the imagery, Sharon is walking with her mother on reserve, love and affection being expressed between them. She asks her mother, "Why were you so confused in this life?" Mom immediately transforms into a little girl in the residential school, crying on the bed. Sharon comforts her, and Mom wants to go home with her. Sharon says, "It's like she's in prison. I'm just so helpless." There's also a scene where she glimpses her granny at home and sees how sad and lonely she was when her kids were away at the res school. Deceased relatives greet and encircle Sharon. Granny prays and speaks of the protection medicine that she's made and that she gives Sharon. She gives her instructions on how to use it. Then we go to a Sundance ceremony. Sharon feels the vibrations of being there. It's an incredible experience. The colors, the dancing, the music and drums. There are many elders witnessing Wapsi Panishi Ikwe. Elder George cries out, "We witness Wapsi Panishi Ikwe and the understanding she has of her life and her people." It was a sacred moment. Sharon dances with Granny, who puts her eagle whistle around Sharon's neck and saying, "Little one, so precious." In this session, Sharon receives stark insight into the confusion and pain of her mother's life and the loneliness of Granny as a mother. It was like a bird's eye view of the residential school and transgenerational grief. And the remainder of the session was full of healing and completion, including the Sundance, which acknowledged her growth and her deep internal understanding. Our last session, number 11, was a series review, and in this, each of us reviews the series on our own, and then we meet and go over it. What Sharon found the most striking was the emerging theme and pattern, which only became clear when I hypothesized about it in the review session. The early images of wounding and loss, while receiving healing ceremonies and supportive love, through to the final sessions when she herself became the healer. She said that this, coupled with the subsequent positive real-life interactions with her brothers, made this a transformation of huge magnitude. It was the review session that hooked up the last few connectors necessary for her to really see what had occurred. She felt like she was being initiated throughout the series without ever consciously realizing it. This mirrored the way her granny had initiated her, subtly, while simply being in life. And if I can have a few moments to speak as a summary, that number 1 for Sharon was the reality of being adopted as the outcome of the government's 60 scoop travesty. As we talked about, the core issues are identity, belonging, and loss. In Sharon, there was a pervasive sense of unbelonging, confusion, and wounding. Who was she raised, and who was she born to be? Sharon felt that the images that arose in her sessions were consistent with who she really is, not the Sharon Jinkerson of adoption. That she was finally integrating a fragmented psyche, discovering who she really is. This represented a true healing of the wounds of adoption for her. She called her First Nation sweats rituals of belonging, whereas the Bonny method, she said, was a deeper ritual of healing. And there were positive, unexpected events that occurred after her imagery work. The mutual responsiveness amongst her family of origin was unprecedented, and it seemed as though the healing had transgressed the boundaries of her own person, like an interconnectedness of psyches, creating a mutuality of growth with far-reaching effects. Another example of this was do you want to speak about this now? What she realized 10 years later was a death prophecy in session 6.
Yeah, in that session, there was a sequence of images that I experienced in a canoe with my partner. He's Peter in the sessions for reasons of confidentiality, but in reality his name was Victor. And in the imagery in the year 2000, Victor's voice said, "Go into the water." And he did this, patting me down with cedar boughs. Victor was Simshan from Hartley Bay. And I went into the water, and when I emerged on the other shore, Victor wasn't with me, which at the time didn't weigh in necessarily as a significant point. And there's lots more to it, so I'm just giving the real bullet points here. But 10 years later, Victor, almost to the day of that session, Victor had passed away in open heart surgery. And for some odd reason, I was alone. Victor was a mask carver and an amazing artist. And so I was all by myself, and I suddenly realized we were smothered with people being helpful. But suddenly, in the middle of the night, I couldn't sleep for about a week after Victor died. And I realized he was going to be cremated in the morning, and in the blur of phone calls, they'd asked me if I wanted to attend that ritual of Victor's cremation, and I felt I couldn't. I didn't want that left in my psyche. So suddenly I'm by myself. We lived on a tiny Gulf island at the time, and I'm by myself, and 1 minute I'm fine, and the next minute I collapse. I'm falling apart. I'm pacing. It's early in the morning. I'm feeling such a searing pain that I just think I'm going to explode. I just can't, my body can't hold the level of pain. And so I rush downstairs. I'm getting fire to keep the fireplace going, to keep my physical needs met. And I turn and I look, and Victor, for the first time in all of his carving career, the week before he was home, he had a long illness. He'd cleaned off his carving bench, and it was always a total clutter of this and that. And there was his carving bench, and in the center was a photograph of his mother. And in the guided imagery 10 years before I went into the canoe, he was talking about his love for his mother. And I'm not thinking about this or connecting or even remembered that session at that moment, but there was his mom's picture. And I lost it again because I knew how much he loved his mom. And I knew that Victor must have realized when he was putting all his tools away that he was going to die. And I went upstairs and I thought, I'm not going to survive this. And suddenly I hear this voice, gentle, wise Victor, saying, go into the water. So suddenly I have purpose. I run and I grab cedar switches. I make a ceremony in the bathroom and I disrobe and I pat myself down with cedar boughs. So when Victor goes into the fire, I submerge myself into the water. So Victor's transforming in fire and I'm transforming in water at the same moment. And I thought, I'm going to keep this to myself, but ended up sharing it at the funeral or celebration of life. And of course, we live in a small island community, and Mary was there, and she remembered the series and the imagery. And she came the next day and with the transcript and said, Sharon, Victor told you to go into the water and he held you. And during that afternoon session, out of the blue, in 2000, Victor made a feast. And I was devastated from that sequence and I couldn't understand it. And Mary said, should I drive you home? And I said, no, I'll be fine. I walked home. This is in 2000. Victor made a feast with salmon. He made cleon, his mother's bread. He decorated the table with cedar boughs and had candles. And I came home from that grief session in tears, and I couldn't stop weeping. And Victor cooked this feast magically out of nowhere. And he guided me we had a big overstuffed 1930s style chair, and he just sat me on his knee and he rocked me and he kept wiping my tears. And when I finally gathered myself after an hour and I kept saying, I don't understand it, and Vic kept saying, it's okay, it's okay. And then when we feasted, for the first only time ever, his grandpa always held up the platters when he prayed, and he did that, Dad. And so when Mary bought the transcript in 2010 when Victor died, I suddenly realized what Vic did during that sequence when he said, go into the water. We spent the whole afternoon having this feast, and he helped me. And then I knew that if he was with me, that's what he would have done. So there was multiple. This is just one example of how the guided imagery. There's other things, as Mary's mentioned, that actually happened in real life. The wolf blanket. There's several things. So it's weird. Did the guided imagery manifest that image, or did I forecast the future?
in multiple ways. But the biggest point about this work is that I think with early childhood trauma, that if you enter, the ceremonies and rituals of my community were amazing, and they brought me home, but I still felt it wasn't focused on the pain and the trauma, and we did some things in sweat lodges, but this concentrated effort and unfolding of the story from your unconscious mind created an incredible opportunity to experience redress, to visit. There's things now that have happened with my siblings, so it almost became a blueprint for what was to come in my life, including I'm a filmmaker, but I'm also employed a lot in research now, finding ways of traditional healing to help in medicine. That's a big part of my career, so that's happened too. But that image of Victor saying go into the water was the most profound. There's other aspects, and it's an even bigger story than that, but that was the core of that session.
Thank you. Now, do we have a lot of questions?
Okay,
Do
so
we?
So we'll move to question and discussion period. So please feel free to type any questions or comments or reflections or that you have for Mary and Sharon. Be sure to click all attendees so that your comments reach me. And as people are doing that, I want to say I was very moved by your story and your honoring of how you've shared the experience of the healing and transformation through the music therapy. I think there's such potential in the arts and music to bring that healing. And so many of our people can, I've witnessed a lot of our people, feeling that lack of sense of belonging and identity, and my own journey in that as well. That it's something that impacts so many of our communities today, and I think part of the healing in our country as well around reconciliation is to have these truths and these stories shared, so that we can witness and honor them and learn from them. So. I'm not seeing any questions yet.
I do have more.
Yeah.
If you want,
Sure.
Unless you want to do something else.
No.
Well, just as part of the summary to do with her culture, she told me that the missionaries, it said that the missionaries found the Anishinaabe people to have inner musings, to be whimsical and childlike, to have dream lives that seemed almost as important as their waking life. And later on, the missionaries perceived this openness to the spirit world to be potentially evil, a blight and something to get rid of. And this was, of course, the attitude that birthed residential school, the tyranny that went on for too many years. Sharon felt that what she's learning to do now in the Bonny method and elsewhere is to learn once again how to dream, how to receive messages from the psyche, how to linger and really see them, and how to be guided and healed by them. In this way, the Bonny method was assisting her to reclaim her lost cultural strength and personality. And then I think she talked about creativity, that she felt blocked when she went in for the series, and that she felt the work with the images unblocked her. There's less mystery to her creativity. It is as though she, as she said, knows the hole to go down to the place where inspiration rises and creativity is born.
I'd like to also comment that one of the fundamental issues I've been a speaker at adoption conferences for years in the 80s when we were changing the adoption legislation in BC. there was consciousness raising, and I was one of several Aboriginal adoptees that were invited to speak at various gatherings. And I also heard a lot of circles. I was hired by the government as a technician when the new Adoption Act was enacted in '96 in BC, and I went across Canada to teach the new legislation to Aboriginal communities so they'd know the ins and outs, and had sharing circles in all these communities. So I've heard thousands of stories, and the general core insecurity that adoptees feel in their identity and who they are is a real blight on, I think, on the potential in our community. We have so much unrealized potential because people don't necessarily trust their intuitive spirit, more expanded creative self, and live skimming the surface. And I felt that I had untapped resource that was limiting my life. And that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to the notion of the Bonny method of guided imagery as another gateway to unlock that. And what it gave me was a sense of confidence that somehow the insecurity that still lingered, even though I was going to community events regularly and ceremonies, and I had 7 years of teachings with my grandmother, I still lacked confidence to put myself out there. That when you're totally taken away from your life givers and the people who brought you into the world are not there, it has a devastating impact on your psyche. There's always, am I worthwhile? Am I worthy? Why do they love me? And even if you're adopted into a loving family, you still ask yourself, especially on mother and daughter days when they look alike and they're dressed alike and you don't have your life giver there, is so devastating. Those are surface things, but it goes way deeper than that. So through this work, I developed the confidence and leadership, and I felt frustrated. I knew that I was putting myself in the sabotaging my career because I was so fear ruled my decisions, fear and insecurity. And the Bonny method, there was a quantum leap in feeling grounded in who I am and secure in myself and trusting my own wisdom and knowledge and insight. And today, when I have a vision, which happens even before the Bonny method, it happened, but it was like fertilizer on a garden. It just nourished that ability even more. So today when I get intuition, just like my granny was this incredible intuitor who would see things and say things that actually happened, or see things in people that were true. And that's what I have. I wouldn't say, I don't think we're ever 100%, but I'm way further along in having mastery and trusting my intuition and what I see and what I feel, and helping others to discover that part within themselves. And I think there's a lot of talk therapy and trauma workshops, and I think the creative opportunities and usefulness of music, especially in this area where there's a really intense identity crisis or lingering issue, that it has the potential to create that confidence and sureness of the soul that I see lacking in so many of my peers who are also adopted. They just don't need reassurance. They just don't quite trust themselves. And so I think that that's a really important point and vital. And as we're having reconciliation for the 60 scoop, I'm hoping that there'll be lots of attention and resources given to this type of work, because I think it's invaluable.
I have a question for you,
Okay.
Mary. So we have people calling in that are health professionals, working in different First Nations communities, where might they find a music therapist to do similar kind of work if they wanted to bring someone in to work with their community?
Oh, okay, so there's music therapists and there's Bonny method
Okay.
of guided
Or
imagery
what
music facilitators, and some of those people are not even music therapists, so it's a range
Right.
of people. But if you, I guess the Association for Music and Imagery will have a listing of people who are trained in the Bonny method. So probably finding their website, the Association for Music and Imagery. And they do have a booklet that lists practitioners.
Okay. We can add a link.
And there's the potential for group work too.
Yes, one of the adaptations I do is using this in a group format, which is quite different. You don't have the constant guiding, but you have the energy of the group, and the music is shorter usually, but it's also very strong to do this in a group in an adapted form. Yeah. Now, have I answered that?
Yes.
If you're looking for a music therapist, well, there's a Canadian Association for Music Therapy. And there may be some people trained in the Bonny method, but not all of them.
Right.
Yeah.
And Sharon, any suggestions or recommendations for individuals or communities on how they can support someone who's been adopted out and wanting to reconnect?
Well, I think in a lot of, we have some amazing communities, a range, but communities are connected to their culture and naming ceremonies. I've heard of amazing witnessing, where a person's story is told in a longhouse, or in my case, this happened at our rain dance, where an elder told my story, and there was a great celebration, and my grandmother had a giveaway to celebrate me coming home. And those events are really significant and important, but there's always a hangover. And the unfortunate thing is that adoption's a middle-class institution, and there's very few resources for post-adoption care, because I think that we need training in our communities. We need a peer support network and ongoing sharing circles for people that have had those experiences. The other big issue, we've got residential school survivors on the radar, but not birth mothers. And one of the paralyzing impacts of reunion is unresolved birth mother issues and birth father issues. This, the shame, the guilt, the things they were told in the hospitals by nuns and priests that were damaging, that they've not addressed, the guilt and shame, the potential for exploitation either way in those relationships, and unfettered rage. We have a long way to go in acknowledging these as a community and making it okay to create a ritual for birth mothers too. Because my mom, who was in the spirit world, never had the fact that she'd given life to myself and my siblings acknowledged and cleansed, because it was just all the aftermath and her helpless, hopeless, frantic lifestyle trying to live in a community, a redneck community 2,000 miles away from her reserve. And so these issues are somewhat touched on in residential school, but we need as much focus on those paralyzing, devastating impacts as well. And I think because we have unresolved birth parent issues, it complicates reunion. We have to hold those parents up so they feel that they can embrace the journey and get a perspective on the historical container within which those situations took place, so that we can move into healing and cleansing those wounds in an open, frank, honest manner. So there's lots of work to clean out the garden to get it ready to plant the seeds of healing. And so I think that that's sort of where we're at.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the session. I'll just read you a couple of comments here. So one participant said, "Love you, Sharon. I can feel your emotions." And the session was so great. Thank you, Mary, for sharing your story. Mary and Sharon. Very moving. So one question here, is there a source of compensation for the 60 Scoop, i.e. residential school?
Yeah, that's happening right now. The government announced an $800 million package for reconciliation, and of that $800 million, $50 million is being set aside for healing and resources, which is one of the reasons why when I was asked to speak about 60 Scoop, I brought Mary, because I think planning for how we're going to reconcile and heal, I think that this particular method done in a way that's sensitive. Mary and I lived in a small community. She knew my family, she knew Victor, and we had a culturally safe container to do this work. And so I'm hoping that, I guess one of the side things of doing this presentation today is hoping to raise awareness about the potential with this particular work and training facilitators in communities, or doing some research to create, because I think there's lots of potential for birth parents as well, and adoptive families too. So that was one of the reasons.
Great. Well, thank you both. Really. Oh, you got one more.
I just wanted to close with a poem.
Okay.
And I don't know if I ever would have written as much without the work I did in the Bonny method, because that was one of the inhibitors, and I didn't trust myself as a creative writer. So I just wanted to close this with everybody, because my granny always said you can't take people into their darkness without giving them some light. So here's a bit of light to finish this session, and it's called Turning. Into the vast plain of dark, empty, my spirit explodes. Motion, movement, white light, spin, spiral, turning round. A translucent sphere emerges, delicate, easily injured. Green grass, fresh, sweet softness covers her ground with protective beauty, where white strawberry blossoms bloom and gentle winds dance the grass, where knock-kneed baby deer take their first steps. In this place where the river flows with emancipating, clear, holy water, and red sparking fire burns warm, and gentle eagle feather wind lift the spark skyward. In this place where my younger self rests and my old one comes for protection, here is where I rise. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I got chills when you're reading your poems. So thank you everyone for participating today, and to you both. Thank Davina for helping answer questions and keep us on track here. So please keep an eye on our website, and look forward to having folks back on the webinar. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.